So good morning. We can start. My name is Luc Baetens. I'm responsible for the industrial consulting at Möbius. I work for Möbius for about, almost 18 years now, specialized in supply chain consulting, and I will host this webinar for today. Before I go into the content, just a few practical aspects I would like to share with you. First of all, you will all notice that you are on mute, so we cannot discuss over voices to avoid all kinds of noises or collateral issues related to microphones. However, we will have a place or a time at the end of the webinar for questions. If you have questions, you can simply write them in the questions box in the GoToWebinar assistant. So in the GoToWebinar tool, you'll see something called questions. If you just drop your questions there, we will pick them up and we will try to answer them at the end of the webinar. Second point, if you would like to receive a copy of the presentation, simply send me or Bram an email at the end of the webinar, and then we will just send you the presentation directly. You'll see our email addresses during the questions section, right? And then the last one, at the end of the webinar, you see a survey. So if you close the webinar, you'll come on a landing page with I think 5 questions on how the webinar went, if it was, if you liked it or not. If you can just take 2 minutes to fill that in, that definitely helps us to improve our webinars over time. So I think we can go into the content now. Yeah. So first of all, as an introduction, I think it's important to realize how important inventory is for the performance of a company or the performance of a supply chain. When I explain that, I always try to go back to the notion of return on capital employed, which is basically what shareholders expect from a company. And if we look at the impact of inventory on the return on capital employed, there's different elements. Of course, if we have missing inventory, shortages in inventory, we can lose sales, have an immediate impact on revenues. In some sectors, be it automotive or retail or probably others, companies can pay penalties if they cannot honor the service level they promised to their customers. To maintain service levels, shortages can be compensated with premium freight, and we hear companies talking about the fortunes they pay for premium freight, be it air freight or specific quick road transport. Insufficient inventories can lead to higher production costs because production plans need to be modified continuously, and that also leads, of course, to additional costs. And then on the other hand, having too much inventories increases, of course, the warehousing cost. That's obvious, but in certain environments, it can also lead to scrapping and depreciation if you have stocks that you cannot sell anymore. That would lead, of course, to inventory depreciation. Yeah. And then the final one, of course, is all the inventory that you hold blocks cash that you cannot use for anything else. Yeah. So I think it's pretty obvious, and many people are convinced of that inventory has a quick or an immediate impact on financial performance of a company. Yeah. On the other hand, we see that still many companies look at inventory as a result. It's a consequence. We have too much inventory, we don't have enough inventory, but it's difficult to say why that is, because inventory is considered as the difference or the result of differences between supply and demand. Yeah. Where my point of view is that inventory should not be just a result, it should be the consequence of a decision. And then we notice that taking that decision of how much inventory you actually need is not such an easy thing to do, right? And personally, I see three big issues there, or challenges. The first one is that optimizing an inventory is not the same as optimizing a planning or improving a planning. There's different elements that come into account, that play in the decision, that are not so easy to understand with just basic rules of thumb. The second issue that companies face is that inventories in the end have to play on a very detailed level, on a stock keeping unit level. And just the number of references, the number of stock keeping units to manage makes the process in itself complex. And then number three is that I noticed that the discussion on inventory levels within companies is very rarely a purely objective discussion. It is often mixed with anecdotes, with discussions, or with just historical issues that have their impact on the inventory, right? So that's just as a setting the scene for this discussion. For the rest of the webinar, I'm happy to welcome Professor Bram Desmet. Yeah, I will give you maybe, Bram, the time to present yourself also briefly.
Yep. Thank you, Luc. I was at Möbius for about 13 years in the supply chain, let us say, practice. Over the last 2 years, I've been focusing on further developing Solventure as an organization, and for part of my time, I'm also linked to the Vlerick Business School. And last year, I took the time to try to summarize my experiences on how companies are struggling with inventory. And actually, that led to the book, which is shown here, which is Supply Chain Strategy and Financial Metrics, and of which I will share some of the ideas or the concepts related to inventory.
Yeah, great. Well, I'm happy to have you here.
Thank you, Luc. Happy to be here.
Okay, so maybe a first question for you, Bram. You did the research around that book. What did you notice as target setting? How do companies set those inventory targets on your experience?
Yeah, well, in general, I see two approaches, and we will also discuss these two approaches in this webinar. Like, a first approach is a bottoms-up approach, where we say, okay, I know that there is different types or different layers of inventory. I might need safety stocks, I might have cycle stocks. And the question then really becomes, how much of which type of inventory do I need where in the supply chain? Mm-hmm. So a first way to answer the question, how much inventory do I need, is trying to do a bottoms-up calculation. It's certainly feasible, but I don't see a lot of companies who can actually do that, right? So it might be one of the questions to come back to, like, how come? And because if we don't get to a good bottoms-up target, well, finance will put the pressure on inventory. So if you don't define your own target as a supply chain person, you will get a target, and you will get a target from the finance department, and that will most probably more be a top-down type of target.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and how does that work? And what do you recommend, or what could be a good way of setting those targets for you?
I will start with let's say showing a kind of a risk which I see in companies, and primarily how they, if they don't have good bottom-up targets, how they land up with top-down targets which are not necessarily realistic. So it's also an example which is described in the book. And so what I see in companies is this type of benchmarking, where we say, okay, we look at inventory turns and we compare ourselves to key competitors. So if we are company one, we will compare ourselves with 5 key competitors. And this is inventory turn. So I want to be my turns as high as possible, because that will basically make sure I have a minimal amount of inventory, minimal working capital, minimal cash. And if you do this type of benchmarking, well, it's quite easy, right? If you are company one, if I'm in an audience, I typically ask, what do you think? Who thinks we will land a target of 3 when we do this type of benchmarking? Who thinks we will land a target of, I don't know, 5 to 6? And who thinks we will land a target of around 8 to 9? So if we do this type of benchmarking, most probably we will land ourselves a target which is on the high end. So maybe I get a target of 6 to 7. We will push back on that because we say, yeah, but this is benchmarking and we are comparing apples to pears. So the next step we do is we try to refine the benchmark. Okay, so say to finance, well, this is not us. We are not comparable. We are different. And then finance says, okay, we will compare ourselves to really the key competitors who are in the same niche. And that's what's shown in the second graph. And yeah, we are not very lucky because it appears that company number 2, which had the highest turns in the previous graph, that's really, let's say, a key competitor who is active in the same segment of high-end projection, right? So instead of reducing my target, I probably just increased my target. So now I have a target of 8 to 9 to 10. And though it's very common for companies, especially from the finance department, to do this type of target setting through this type of benchmarking, it has a big risk. And why does it carry a big risk? That's actually explained in the next slide. So if you start benchmarking in 2 dimensions, then what do we show here? Each dot represents 1 year, and the different curves represent different companies. So what we see is that on the one hand, company number 2 is very efficient in inventory turns, because you see around 2004, it had inventory turns of around 7. It went a bit back and forth, but it's steadily increased its inventory turns to around 10 in 2013. So yes, we can say company number 2 is very good in inventory turns, but if you look at the average profitability, it's hard to read from this graph, but the average profitability of this company, it has a 1.5% EBIT over the last 10 years. Well, 1.5, this is EBIT, so we still need to pay interest, we still need to pay taxes, and then we hope to still have some net profit from which we can pay a dividend to the shareholder. So it's quite likely that this company is actually in financial troubles, right? And the way it has been pushing inventories down is because of a lack of profitability. It's not getting any money from the shareholders or the banks. So if you don't get any money from the shareholders and the banks, you might need to get inventory from reducing inventories, maybe even to an unrealistically low level, right? And so we could say, well, this company number 2 is it's strong. The companies 1 and 2, no, that's a black box. No idea what that's come from. The company 1 and 3 are better balanced. But what you also see, if you look at company number 1, you see that it dropped back in the financial crisis, and it also rebounded. So it's not just about strength in one KPI. We also need to make sure that the KPIs are balanced. And in the end, we also want to show some resilience. Like, we know that each of our markets sooner or later can be disrupted. So if we drop back, how quickly can we come back to earlier level of performance? That's certainly something that company number 1 has shown here. So that's, let's say, a short introduction on what I see companies are doing and the risk of benchmarking in only 1 dimension. I would call it like that.
Exactly. So what you're showing is that if you compare companies, that you should not just compare one metric, but that you should combine a metric with other metrics that could be in counterbalance to that metric, right?
Yes.
Okay. I think what you wrote in your book, as one of the core elements in your book, is that you worked on what are the metrics that should be compared and what are the metrics that you need to balance.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
Right.
Correct.
So maybe it's worth explaining that too.
Yeah. The first trick is, I always say, like, I hope that after having seen this example, you will never accept that in your company somebody from the finance department shows you a benchmark in only 1 dimension, because that's only half of the story, you could say. But the next question, of course, is like, if I accept that I need to benchmark in 2 dimensions or multiple dimensions, which metrics do I then need to compare, right? Which metrics do I need to balance if I want to come to balance? Well, the concept developed in the book for that is the supply chain triangle, where we say, well, I see that companies struggle with balancing this triangle. And for me, it's also one of the key objectives of supply chain, and supply chain as a function is to balance this triangle in the company. And each triangle has 3 corners. So we see on the top here service, we see cost, and we see cash. Well, cost is relatively easy. You see warehousing cost, logistics cost, that's all your operational costs. Cash, well, it's inventory. is equivalent with cash, but more broadly, it's working capital. And then on the top, you see service. And when we think service, we need to take a broad definition of service. So yes, on the one hand, it's the on-time and full delivery performance. It's the lead time, the customer order lead time. But you also need to think of how broad is my product portfolio. So if I have a wider assortment and a wider product portfolio, I also hope your customers perceive that as a better service, right? It also has to do with how flexible am I in the ordering process? Do I impose certain minimum order quantities, or can any customer order in any quantity at any given time? Right? It's also a type of service I deliver. Maybe I have consignment stocks at some of my customers. So all of these are services we as an organization deliver towards a customer. So if you think service here, you really need to take the broad definition or the broad perspective. And why do I say that companies struggle with that? Well, I will give some examples. I see that a lot of companies say, okay, we will start sourcing in the Far East. And why do we source in the Far East? Well, primarily we do that to lower the purchasing cost. And I hope if you start sourcing in the Far East, it lowers your purchasing cost, right? Otherwise, you need to think twice. But at the same time, because of the longer lead times, and sometimes also because of the more difficult quality control, it will also negatively impact your inventory. You might have more safety stocks, or you might have more stocks that in the end you need to write off. So it has certainly a cash impact. Another example, I see a lot of salespeople who say, well, I want to increase my product portfolio. Why? Typically they have objectives to increase the market share, right? When I say increasing the product portfolio, again, I hope it's perceived by your customer as an improved service, and I hope it will support your top line. If it does not, you can have a double question. But increasing the product portfolio typically, again, will also negatively impact your inventory. Not all of these new products will be equally fast moving, right? So you might be creating a longer tail, and that will typically reduce your inventory turns, or on average you will require more inventory, so it will again negatively impact your inventory. What I've also seen in a lot of companies is that inventories go up and down, and then finance at some point in time says, guys, we're done with it, we need to get to grips with the inventory. Actually, we are going to reduce inventories with 30%, right? Then we launch a lot of initiatives. We do not necessarily free up the necessary resources in the organization to really do it, or we don't provide the, let's say, the decent tools to support that type of project. So around the summer period, we start panicking because we had high ambitions, but none of the projects really got on track. So we have to reduce inventories with 30%, and instead of having reduced, we have increased with 10%. In my career, I've seen that many times. So then we resort to the handbrake. And what is the handbrake in inventory optimization? It's lowering the safety stocks. And okay, I can witness that if you lower your safety stocks, the good thing is that the inventory will go down, right? So the inventory will go down, but the bad thing is, of course, that you will negatively impact the service. And if you negatively impact the service, you will see all kinds of operational firefighting costs. So we will start flying stuff around the world. We will disrupt our production sequence to let's say, meet the order of an important customer and so on. So we will have a lot of operational firefighting costs, so we will be completely out of balance here. And these are just illustrations on how I see that companies struggle with balancing that supply chain triangle. And I have two questions, or when I explained that to companies, the first question was, how come that we struggle with the balance? And well, if you look at a traditional organization chart, this is how it could look like. So we are very functionally organized. And if I'm the VP of sales and marketing, and I step into the car in the morning, well, the first thing I think of is probably like, what's my sales, turnover, market share, so typically top-line oriented metrics. If I'm in production, in general, my primary concern will be efficiency, because efficiency lowers cost. If I'm in purchasing, my primary thing will be cost. How can I reduce my spend? Finance will have more financial language, so they will be talking about earnings per share or free cash flow. So what's the link to the outside world and more the financial community? And if you see how that translates into the triangle, this is what we see. So in general, in companies, my feeling is that people in sales and marketing, they are primarily putting the top side of the triangle, whereas people in operations, they are primarily putting the cost side of the triangle. And in some companies, that's where it stops, right? So it seems like an eternal debate between sales and operations. And that was, for me, until the financial crisis. And since the financial crisis, my feeling is that companies have become more cash aware. So inventory has become more important. And all of a sudden you have the CFO who says, well, guys, I'm done with it. Inventory is going up with plus 50% and then minus 50%. We need to work with a constant level of inventory, and we need to lower that level of inventory, right? Well, it's by putting inventory really into the equation that you close the triangle and that you create the pressure on the triangle. And the second question, I guess, for companies is like, is it important? Does it matter? Because is this not the way how companies work? Won't there always be conflicting objectives between sales and marketing and finance, and will different departments not always talk a different language? Is that not even a source of creative energy, right? The tension which we put in there. And I thought about it, and my answer is no. I do not agree. And why is that? Well, that's the next slide actually here. Well, if you look at service, service is a driver for top line, right? And if I look at the company from an investor's perspective, I say, well, I'm not only concerned with top line. Why? Because, well, in the end, I also want to see a margin or a profit. The good thing here is if service is a driver for the top line, well, if I combine the service and the cost side of the triangle, I get to a margin metric, something like EBIT. And even then, as an investor, I'm not only concerned with the margin, because if I have two companies who generate 100 million of EBIT, and the first company requires 100 million of cash, and the second company requires only 50 million of cash, yeah, then most probably I want to do the second investment twice, right? So I'm not only concerned with margin, I'm concerned with the margin over the capital invested, and the cash is actually the third side of the triangle, right? So I'm concerned with the EBIT over the capital employed, or the margin over the cash employed. It's like the Americans would say, I'm concerned with the bang for the buck. What do you give me as a return on the invested capital? And that's a crucial insight, because we say, well, we're balancing the triangle here is the game of supply chain, because supply chain has to deliver the service and make sure we have the lowest cost, and also do it with a minimal inventory. So that's really the supply chain game. But it's also the game of finance. So supply chain and finance really have the same objective. Balancing the triangle is also a way to maximizing the shareholder value. And linking that back to our benchmarking question, so which type of metrics do I need to compare? Well, if you only look at service, but you don't look at cost and cash, you only have one side of the equation, right? If I only look at inventory, but I don't look at what's the margin that we generate from the inventory, again, I only have one part of the equation. If I would be able to benchmark in 3 dimensions, I would probably want to see a service metric, a cost metric, and a cash metric. In Excel, we can only do it in 2 dimensions. So that's why we combined the service and the cost, or the top line and the bottom line, into EBIT, a margin. So margin was on the vertical axis and inventory was on the horizontal axis. So we took a margin metric and a capital employed metric. And in the book, we analyzed many more metrics and say, okay, what look like the best metrics to benchmark, and what's the advantage and the disadvantages of using different metrics when you do that type of benchmarking.
Yeah. Do you explain it as the supply chain being responsible for the balancing of the triangle? I was now just thinking, does that mean that return on capital employed should be the main performance metric for a supply chain?
Yes, I'm convinced that to win the battle that supply chain is having in companies, it should install return on capital employed as the metric for the organization, because that leads to the right trade-off type of discussions. And it should make sure that type of metric is shared. And, because if supply chain as the only one would have that metric, it would fail. It would still face a difficult fight, because some companies will be more sales driven, and then supply chain will be in a weaker position. Some companies will be more production driven, and then supply chain will be in a more difficult production, and still other companies will be finance driven. Well, you will only get to a more balanced discussion, and also you will only get to an optimization of the shareholder value if that return on capital employed gets into a shared metric.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought. Yeah. So if you take this triangle idea now and you look at the way you did the benchmarking from one of your first slides where you showed the benchmarking of the different companies, how can you see that trade-off show up on the benchmarking? Does that mean that if you look at different companies, that on those kind of two-dimensional benchmarking, that you should identify what kind of trade-off they are looking for?
Yeah. Well, in the book we developed a technique to now, let us say, use these insights and say, okay, in the end, it's about maximizing the bang for the buck. It's about maximizing the return on capital employed. And it could be okay to have very high inventory turns, but if I don't generate enough EBIT, I might not necessarily be in a good position, right? So we try to combine these different insights into a benchmarking technique, which can really be used and which helps us to set balanced targets. And the real trick to get to that is, we already saw that two-dimensional benchmark graph, and the main trick is adding that dashed line here, which we call the bang for the buck line. So the ROCE principle tells us, like, it's okay if your EBIT is lower, as long as you need less inventory. Or vice versa, it's okay if you need more inventory, as long as you compensate for that with a higher EBIT, right? As an investor, I'm concerned with the EBIT you generate over the inventory investments, the bang for the buck. Well, the dashed line here shows all the combinations of EBIT and inventory turns leading to the same bang for the buck, right? So if I need more inventory, so if I shift here to the left, my turns are lower, I see that I need to compensate for that with a higher EBIT. Or vice versa, if my EBIT would be lower, I say that's okay, but then you need less inventory. Yeah? So your turns need to be higher. So as long as we are on the line here, I'm indifferent as an investor. It's the investor's indifference curve, or the bang for the buck curve. And this dashed line here corresponds with the maximum performance of company number one. Right? So you see that in 2012, and 2004 is close to the line. 2012 and 2004 actually were very good years from this perspective, looking at company number one. And how can we now use it for target setting? Well, you see here the performance of company one in 2013. Let's see what was the performance in 2014. So that's added in the next slide. So that was 2013, and we see that the performance in 2014 dropped back. So we see that actually inventory turns dropped back, so we had more inventory, and you see that the EBIT was lower, right? So we had more inventory with less EBIT. Well, that's not necessarily what we want, right? So after that type of year, CFO unhappy, CEO unhappy, investors unhappy, there's a huge pressure in the organization to improve. And then I see really a lot of improvisation in companies, like what would now be a good target for 2015. Well, once we have defined that maximum performance line here, the dashed line, we can say, okay, well, this is actually our line. It's our performance that we want to reach as a company. So at least we want to get back to that type of performance, right? And I can connect back to that type of performance in two ways. So on the one hand, I could say, well, I now have inventory turns of around 3. So I can connect to that maximum performance line by just going straight up, which means I stay with inventory turns of 3, but my target is to improve EBIT to around 10%. I can also connect to the line in a different way and say, okay, instead of just going straight up, let's go right and up. So I want to improve to inventory turns of around 4.5 and improve my EBIT to around 7%. The good thing from this type of benchmarking is, yes, I know that every company would like to have inventory turns of 10 and an EBIT of 15%. But that's not going to happen. right?
Yeah.
That's certainly not realistic. It's not what we as a company have done before. You can easily calculate comparable curves for key competitors. None of our competitors has ever realized that level of performance. So that's clearly out of range. That's unrealistic. Here we come to the realistic targets, because we as a company were close to that level of performance at least 2 years over the last 10 years. So it's stretched, but it's realistic.
Yeah. Does that mean that you say that in fact the dotted line is more comparable from one company to the other than the different performances separately? That you could say this is a good dotted line or the right dotted line to be on,
yeah,
if I'm in a certain sector?
Yes, I believe that in any case you will have leaders and laggards, right? So some companies will be one step ahead, some companies will be one step behind, and some companies will be 3 steps behind. So if you would look at the top dashed line here, actually it's good to calculate it for the different competitors and then say, okay, what seems like a good reference in my sector? But okay, the least you should do is get back to your own performance, right?
Yeah.
So that's what we've done here, but you can certainly compare with other key competitors as well and then see how far do we want to put the stretch. That's certainly something which is possible. The key question left here is like, okay, what do we do? Do we go straight up? So do we put all the pressure on the EBIT improvement, or do we want to have a combined improvement?
Yeah.
If I ask that question to people, typically they go for the combined improvement. Why? Because it feels more secure. Like putting all the pressure on EBIT improvement seems like a less realistic target.
Yeah.
And what's also developed in the book is that I strongly believe that has to do with the choice of strategy, right? Because the position you take on the curve is actually a strategic choice, right? Operational excellence players, which are low-cost players, what will they do? Well, to realize the lowest cost, they will try to cut as much complexity as possible. They will really focus on the fast-moving volumes. So they will have less complexity, they will have less inventory, or they will have higher inventory turns. Typically, they will also work with a minimal margin. Why? Because they want to have the lowest price in the market. To have the lowest price in the market, they will work with a minimal margin. But that fits well in here. We say, well, it's okay for Aldi to work at the lower margin, because we know that Aldi will employ less capital. They have less SKUs, they will have less inventory, they will have higher efficiency on their shop floor, right? So they will employ less capital. So the OPEX position is typically on the right here. If I'm a customer intimacy player, I want to go for the best total solution, so I will need to have a broader product portfolio. If you need to have a broader portfolio, you will employ more capital, right? Not all of these products will be fast moving. You will start introducing a long tail. So your inventory turns of the customer intimacy player will be lower than that of the OPEX player. But typically you can also drive a premium from being the one-stop shop. So your margin, your EBIT should be higher. So the customer intimacy player is over here. The product leader, I typically put it to the left. Why? For me, he has the highest complexity. And it's not necessarily the product portfolio, which is very complex. It's primarily the product itself, which becomes very complex. He has a high innovation rate, so he will work with the latest technologies or the latest high performance materials. He will need to work with niche suppliers. Maybe there's only 1 or 2 or 3 niche suppliers in the world, and some of them are located in Asia with long lead times and so on. A product leader also needs to place a lot of bets, right? So not all of the new products will immediately be a success. So he might have some wrong bets and then carry a high inventories for products who don't get to the right level of adoption. But the good news is that he can typically drive the highest premium for his products from his customers, because he's almost in a kind of a monopoly position. That's his ultimate goal. And again, that's good from an investor's perspective. I'm okay as an investor that a product leader requires more inventory, as long as he can compensate for that with a higher EBIT. And so also for this company, number one here, and again, it's described in more detail in the book, well, the choice between going straight up or right and up is in fact a strategic decision, right? And from a supply chain perspective, it's important that you force the organization to make that strategic decision. So I sometimes say it's perfectly fine to say we will stay with the inventory turns of 3. Company 1 historically was a product leader. You can see that in 2004, it had inventory turns of around 2.7 with an EBIT of around 12%. That was the product leader position. So if that's still our ambition and the strategy we want to pursue, most probably I need to stick to the turns of 3 and say, well, the problem is not in the inventory turns, the problem is really in the margins. And maybe we don't have the successful products or the successful technology today, which allows us to drive that superior performance or that superior EBIT from our customers. And we need to make sure that supply chain is not the victim and doesn't get the unrealistic target to move to 4.5, while we did not change the strategy of the product leadership. So we keep the complex supply chain, but we get a target of 4.5 inventory turns that will never work, and that will simply create chaos in the organization. And that's also what I've seen companies doing, and that's where I hope that this type of techniques can shed a different light on how to set inventory targets.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, it's a very clear way of showing how strategy drives a choice on inventory and inventory strategy, which I like a lot. The question I still have is, if you take this, suppose as a supply chain you drive that change, you drive that decision, right? So at some point, indeed, company 1 has decided, okay, I'm a product leader, I'm fine with this kind of inventory turns, given the margin I have, etc. How do we bring it then back to operational targets, right? And I wanted to just for the exercise here take back the link with what you call the bottom-up approach, right? So if we look at inventories and we look at the function of inventories, right, we know that there are 5 functions. Yeah. So we have the process, the inventory that is in the process. We have the inventory that you keep for strategic reasons, and then we have the safety stocks, anticipation stocks, and cycle stocks. So if we look at those different strategies, can we think of examples of how how a strategy chosen on the dotted line has an impact on these categories of inventories? Now, I immediately think that if you are, say, if you're a product leader, and as you said, your product is more complex, you allow more complex technologies that can have an impact on your in transit or your in process stock, because your process itself can become longer, etc. Do you see other examples in this case? Maybe we can just think about it for a moment.
Yeah. Well, in general, if you take operational excellence and you compare with customer intimacy and product leadership, customer intimacy and product leadership add more complexity, right? Yeah. And if you look at a product leader, well, to be able to have the lowest price, he will need to maximize efficiency. If you want to maximize efficiency, you are focusing on simplicity and getting as much complexity out. So if you would then look at start comparing the operational excellence with customer intimacy, certainly if you go to customer intimacy, you will start introducing the long tail. You want to go for the one-stop shop, the full product portfolio. If you get to that long tail, you will have more slow-moving products. If you have more slow-moving products and you still want to give a good service level, you know it will inflate your safety stocks. And also for more slow-moving products, either if I produce it myself or if I need to buy it, for instance, in the Far East, well, the minimum order quantity or the minimum production batch might be inflating the cycle stock. So certainly your turns will start reducing if you start introducing the long tail, because safety stocks are inflated, cycle stocks are inflated, and probably also the risk on that inventory increases, because if it's only fast moving product, probably the risk is relatively low. But if I have more slow moving stock, the chances that I need to start depreciating stock afterwards or writing off stocks afterwards is also increasing. So the inventory dynamics start differentiating. And of course, you need this type of calculations to really come to a good bottoms up calculation of what is the inventory I now really require, and the strategy will define like, okay, what's the level of complexity I accept. If I'm an OPEX player, I don't want to see a long tail, right? If I'm a customer intimacy player, I will really need that long tail. That long tail is a key element in my strategy. That's the way I want to differentiate in the market. And switching to the product leaders, indeed, product leaders, well, if I'm really a niche player and I have high performing niche products, chances are real I don't even have make to stock, right? So that I have make to order, or I have even engineer to order. So the complexity is not necessarily in the product portfolio or the finished product stock. The complexity is most probably in the product itself, right? So if I have a better product, probably it simply has more components, or it has more ingredients, which are more difficult to produce. So I might have a more complex supply chain in the sense that I have more suppliers, I have more raw materials, I have more components, I have more intermediates, I have a longer overall supply chain process. So I expect that what you do here is some of these calculations are also shifting to intermediates and to raw materials. Like if you then look at safety stocks or anticipation stocks or cycle stocks, how much inventory do I really need of key raw materials and key components? And also there I know that some of these components, I will have a long tail of components, right? And in that product leadership position, then also initiatives like design for supply chain, or trying to design platforms to kind of stimulate more common components to reduce part of that complexity more on the component or the raw material level. I think that's the name of the game in the product leader's position. So it's less on the finished product, but it will be much more on the product complexity itself. And from that perspective, if you look at inventories on raw material and component inventory and any intermediates you have or sub-assemblies you have.
Yeah. What I've seen also in product leadership environments is that you get more and more impact on strategic stocks. As you're saying, if you get into more developed products, more complex products, you might have a very, very crucial or critical raw materials where you are almost obliged to secure at an extremely high level the raw materials to guarantee that you can keep that competitive edge even in a market where certain raw materials can be shortage or can be limited in supply, where you are also then kind of building up inventories that are not always easy to
what that also triggers
explain.
with me is what I have seen a lot in technology players is that if you are a product leader, you are working with high-end, top-end components, which also have a high innovation rate, but you have certain guarantees to make towards your customers. So you also have a lot of last time buys where you say, okay, I still need to deliver this product to that customer for 3 or 5 years, but this component will now be stopped by this or that supplier. And so there's a lot of, that's also extra drivers for inventories and product leaders, certainly in the technology industry, where on the one hand you are captured by your customers, where you need to deliver the same products for 3 to 5 years, but there's a high innovation rate on the components that you are using in your product. So that's all extra complexity, which is being loaded on product leaders. But okay, as long as you play the game successfully, you are able to drive really a superior gross margin and a superior profit, EBIT from your customers. But as a product leader, you really need to avoid that you get the targets, inventory targets of the OPEX player. And if you just do a one-dimensional benchmark and you only look at inventory turns, you will look like the worst in class. You have inventory turns of 3 and everybody else in the industry is doing better, right? So people will force you to take an inventory target of 4 or 5 or 6, but that's really not compatible with the complexity you have. And that's a big danger for you and for supply chain people, that if they can't push back at that time, they really have an issue.
And with them, then the investor who sees that the strategy gets
the whole organization will get screwed up, because we will never get to that 4 or that 4.5, or if supply chain would really push that through, you will start having issues with service, or you will really need to start flying in components in a non-cost optimal way. So then you will really skew the triangle towards that inventory corner, and that then you are really destroying shareholder value. I agree.
Yeah, good. Right, so it brings us back to where we started, right?
Yeah.
Shareholder value.
Yeah.
Nice. There's a last element I wanted to add, assuming that we go through this exercise, right? So we do the strategic exercise, we come to a target, we manage to translate that target into operational targets through, for example, these classes, right? Then a last thing I think is important to add to that personally is the capacity of an organization to monitor that, right? And also there, I think the fact of having different categories and a clear target completely changes the monitoring, right? Where you can start with one number and evaluate whether that one number, the inventory turns, stays on the right line, right? That's probably not enough, right? So you'll need to see at which point inventory within that big number is balanced, right? Where I'm a proponent of this logic of measuring under and overstocks, right? Call it an inventory service level or whatever, where basically you measure separately the items and the inventory where you are below your target, and on the other hand, you manage the inventories, or you look at the inventories for the items where you're above the target, and basically your objective is to set up improvement actions to avoid, well, both of the red blocks, basically, right? The red block where you are creating a potential risk on your service, and then on the other hand, the items where you are having more inventory than you actually need to realize your strategy. Right.
Yeah, I fully agree. And that's probably, you need to have a realistic target, let's say top down, because if the top down expectations are not realistic, and that's a big danger, the game gets really screwed up. But it's not by having the good, let's say, top line target that you have the right balance in your inventory. So, and having a good monitoring of the balance in your inventory indeed requires setting targets for the different layers you suggested on the previous slide. So I'm also a big fan of this type of measuring to follow up your inventory health and see if you still have the right inventory of the right product.
Yeah, good. So I think we can conclude the presentation part here and go over to the questions. So this is the time. If you have questions, you can go to the question box in the GoToWebinar interface. So you'll see it somewhere in the lists. There you have probably polls or you have a box where you can just type in the questions that you might have, and then we can answer them right away. Right. Okay, so I'll maybe start with the first question that comes here, Bram. That is, if you have those targets, or we say, okay, the target is extremely important. Who do you think in the organization should be responsible for that target? I heard you say supply chain a couple of times. I heard you say finance. Who should be? How should that work? That target setting in terms of roles and responsibilities to you.
Well, I think in the end, if supply chain, in a lot of companies, I see that supply chain gets the inventory target. And the inventory target is being set by finance, top down. That's what I see in a lot of companies. And at that point in time, supply chain is at a big risk. So I think supply chain is a good one to set targets, because if you want to do a bottoms-up calculation, you need a lot of analytical competence, which you typically find in supply chain. You also need a good understanding of the supply chain complexity, which finance will typically not have, but it is available in supply chain. So supply chain should define that bottom-up target, and supply chain should also push back towards finance and also towards the president of the division, because I once told the CFO, dear CFO, you should not be setting the target for the inventory turns. It should be the president of the division. You should basically say to that president of the division, I want you to deliver 50% ROCE. If you want more inventory, that's fine with me, but then you need to deliver a higher EBIT. Right? If you can't deliver the EBIT, I'm fine with that, but then you need to reduce the inventory as a result. So the ultimate responsibility for balancing EBIT and inventory should be with the president of a division or a business unit. and supply chain should make sure that the president of the division is making a well thought through decision, right? And I'm sure that supply chain will need to be the challenger there, because the average president of a division, unfortunately, is lacking the balance himself. It could be more a sales-driven type of person who's less concerned about inventory. So supply chain will need to educate the organization to make sure that the president can set the right type of targets. And potentially supply chain will need to support that with doing the analysis and doing the calculation. But setting the target for me would be the ultimate responsibility of the president of the division.
Yeah, I agree. What I think, what I would add to that is the way I see it. If you look at the ultimate or the perfect supply chain department, in the end, the supply chain function looks a lot like a finance function. It's one of the few functions in a company that are by their nature transversal, right? Where one looks at more operational numbers and the other at financial numbers. So there's a kind of a logical collaboration between those two to come to this kind of targets, because both have the ambition and the objective to look over the entire chain, and one they just look in different units of measure. So it's a pretty good combination, probably, to have a target setting done, right?
And what that triggers to me, that's also what I hear in companies, is that finance historically has been very good in explaining the past. I think where supply chain has been very good in predicting the future. So from that perspective, I also feel the same. And also supply chain has an opportunity to claim that domain and to make sure everything which is forward-looking and which is about making the right type of decisions, that supply chain claims that type of questions also in the organization.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and another question that I see coming is we have more and more calculation power. On the one hand, on the other hand, I hear here a link between inventory targets and a strategy. What is then the frequency that you would need to review those targets? Should we go with, we have more data, we have more calculation power, so we should recalculate more frequently, or should we stick to something to have a more strategic line in inventory targets? How do you think about that?
Yeah, well, I think the bottom-up calculation is typically something which you do more frequently, right? There I was always a big fan of saying, okay, I will update my inventory parameters every month, but rather take some more history in the calculation, which automatically will provide some kind of smoothing. So make sure that your bottoms-up targets are evolving, make that a kind of frequent update process. If you look at the strategy, at least you have the budgeting process.
So we had a little sound issue.
Sound glitch. Yeah. From the strategy perspective, at least when you do the budgeting process, this kind of questions pops up. And for me, it would be good to have, when you do your strategy and or budget review, to kind of have a 3 to 5 year plan also for the targets. Even where you say, okay, we are now at this level of performance. We know that type of company is the reference in our sector, but also in the same side of same type of strategy. That's equally important. We know we're not going to close the gap in 1 year, right? So having ambitious targets 2, 3 to 5 years out, for me that would make sense, but it's not something I see companies doing today. For me, it's more like, okay, there's the budgeting round, and then we know finance is going to hit us. Then we are being hit. We try to push back without being successful. That's more the type of situation I see with supply chain people in companies.
That's like a positive message to start to end with, right? Let's see if you don't have any questions anymore. I think we can conclude here. Thank you, Bram, for joining us for this webinar. Thank you all for participating. If all goes well, you should have now like 2 more minutes until 11. That should give you exactly the time you need to fill in our survey, right? So thank you very much. I hope you liked it. Thank you. Have a good day, and I hope to talk to you soon. Bye.